Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, anybody on the left, anybody on the right who can think clearly, and we want to present their opinions and their insight and their studies to you unedited and unaltered so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it will come back, maybe it won't, who knows. With us today, it is our privilege to have Dan. I'm going to take a shot at this. Demetriou.
Demetriou.
Dan Demetriou. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota Morris. The professor has been at University of Minnesota Morris from 2015 to present. He's also an associate professor there for a while, back in 2009. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Colorado Boulder, also a MA in philosophy from Texas A&M, an MA in Youngstown State University and Ambassador University, very well educated. Some of the work that he has worked on, honor ethics, the challenge of globalizing value alignment in AI, defense with dignity, how the dignity of violent resistance informs the gun rights debate, questioning the assumptions of moralism, universalism, and interpretive dominance in the racist monument debates, dignitarian hunting, a rights-based defense, civic immorality, the problem of civic honor in Africa and the West. What should realists say about honor cultures? Honor war theory, there's some fetish in your ethics, justifying punishment, a modest institutionalist reply to Green's fMRI-based objections to deontology, and fictionalist attitude problems. And today we're going to focus on guns and monuments and why these two issues get polarized. This was one of the first papers that I found, and then I also found this paper. But before we get into that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Do we need to correct anything with your background, your bio?
No, that's basically it.
Okay, great. Well, let's go right to the meat and potatoes here. So this was a study, Defense with Dignity, how the dignity of violent resistance informs the gun rights debate, published in 2022. Perhaps the biggest disconnect between philosophers and non-philosophers on the question of gun rights is over the relevance of arms to our dignitary interests. This essay attempts to address this gap by arguing that we have a strong prima facie moral right to resist with dignity and that violence is sometimes our most and only dignified method of resistance. Thus, we have a strong prima facie right to guns when they are necessary, often enough for effective, dignified resistance. This approach is distinctively non-libertarian. It doesn't justify gun rights on the basis of more liberty or security. Nonetheless, it is compatible with libertarian defenses of gun rights, and in fact, lowers the bar for gun rights in some ways, as it justifies access to guns, even when nonviolent means would be better to achieve liberty and secure aims of potential victims. And although this defense of gun rights is most readily categorized as conservatist or rightist, it relies upon principles and institutions about dignity popular among progressives in other domains such as disability, women's, or LGBTQ rights debates. Professor, what is this white paper about, and why is it an important discussion to talk about how different people view the gun rights debate? You said something there at the end of the abstract that I found quite shocking, which is that some of the gun rights depend upon liberal principles. Am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. If you want to advance a conservative thesis in an academic journal, you have to be extremely rhetorically savvy. And you have to frame things for people who have a very different ideological framework. You have to mount an argument based on premises that they understand and feel. The data in ethics is our moral intuitions. And the reason people on the left are on the left is because they have certain sorts of intuitions about certain sorts of cases. And the reason people are on the right are because they have different intuitions about cases, right? So you have to elicit the right intuitions from your audience if they're the gatekeepers, right? So my strategy here for the ambitious project I was setting forth, which is to land a openly conservative and rightist defense of guns in a top philosophy journal, was one in which you have to engage with the referees, who are going to be overwhelmingly on the left. And so the strategy is well, you have these intuitions about other domains, right? So if you're going to have the intuitions I want you to have in these other domains, then you have to see why they would also apply to guns, or at least it's not crazy to think that they would also apply to guns. So that's part of the deal. Another thing that's going on here is that this debate, like a lot of debates in philosophy, insofar as there's any debate left, because of, it's becoming a bit of a monoculture between various sorts of infighting among the left, you'll hear some libertarians, okay, entering into the debate. And a lot of times people make the mistake of thinking the libertarian position is the rightist position, and then there's just conservative crazy people, okay? And so what I'm trying to do in this essay and some others is say, okay, well, there's, this libertarian position, and there's this progressive or left position, but there's also this conservative position, and it's different from both of those. And the way I approach it in this essay is that actually when you think about the way we're morally processing the question, on this question, conservatives are actually closer to leftists than conservatives are to libertarians, even though the conservative and the libertarian are going to be more inclined to be in favor of guns. So my strategy is look, you on the left really care about dignity when it comes to LGBT rights. You care about dignity when it comes to women's rights. And so when you care about it when it comes to disability. So, all right, let's just apply that sort of thinking to guns, right? So I start off, after a brief literature review, I start off with pointing out like this case where, God, I think it was about 10 years ago that there was a push in Colorado to allow students to take guns to Colorado campuses, okay, state schools. And, obviously a lot of administrators were very concerned about this, and a lot of people didn't want this to happen. And they wanted to reassure and give some guidance to students about, well, look, you can sort of protect yourself without relying on guns. So they actually had this page up at Colorado State University about some self-defense tips for women if they're being sexually assaulted on campus, right? And the advice included like acting like you're crazy, urinating on yourself, shitting on yourself, throwing up, stuff like this. And this just pissed everybody off. Like feminists got upset with it. Like the left didn't respond positively to this sort of advice at all, even though you will find that some, so-called self-defense experts say it's actually probably pretty useful if you're being, like a sort of jump out of the bushes sort of rape attack. So that's my in, right? Why? What, the problem you have here is clearly that no one is doubting that these women have a right to self-defense. But you don't like that they're being forced to defend themselves in undignified ways, right? So this suggests that you think, right, that's highly intuitive, that we don't just have a right to self-defense. We have a right to defend ourselves in a dignified manner. And once you grant that, a lot seems to follow. Or take disability. Like I give this thought experiment that seems to work with my audience of like here's like this is like a meme, or like this really resonates with the left on a lot of dimensions. The idea of a person who's wheelchair bound at the bottom of the courthouse steps, right? And can't access that courthouse because there's steps and that person's wheelchair bound, right? And this is, often used when talking about liberty rights and stuff like this. Liberty means that you give people access to institutions, right? So you got to make sure there's ramps. But why ramps? Like, so I give this thought experiment about, well, suppose you just hired these really burly bailiffs at every court, really strong. And they just, you wheel yourself up to the bottom of the courthouse steps, and these bailiffs lift you up out of your chair, and they carry you in their arms up the steps and take you to where you need to go. You just tell them where you need to go, and they take you happily, right? Look, it's effective. It's comfortable, you don't have to do any work, right? I mean, if you have to wheel yourself up a ramp, that takes effort, right? So it's way more convenient to use the beefy bailiffs. But every time I give that case, oh no one likes that, right? Because it's an undignified way to ambulate around, if you're wheelchair bound. Again, so we have this principle that it isn't just about a right of access to our institutions, but a right to dignified access to our institutions by disabled people. So again, right, so it's what we want to be able to do the things we have a right to do with dignity. And so if we have a right to self-defense, then we have a right to self-defense with dignity.
That's fascinating. I see what you're doing, and that's a fascinating argument that it's not good enough to just have access to the rights. You must have the ability to access them in a dignified manner. So people who are in a wheelchair, it's undignified for them to say, hey, please carry me up the steps, rather than to have their own ramp so they can move themselves as they choose and when they want, like everybody else, given the same dignity and the same accessibility as much as we possibly can. And nobody doubts that. Nobody says, hey, wheelchair people, you don't have a right to your own ramps. No, I'm in California. No one would dare say that. Of course you have a right to do that. Of course you have the right to try to be as much of a citizen with all the accessibilities that we have. And then you're also saying, well, women have the right to defend themselves on college campuses, other than peeing on themselves, throwing up on themselves, and acting crazy as their only form of self-defense, because those are undignified acts. And why can't we apply that same thinking to the ability to own a gun and defend yourself? Is that roughly the argument?
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, there more is necessary. I mean, you have to roll out a theory about why violence is so often more dignified than nonviolence, than nonviolent resistance.
Yeah. Right. I never heard of that's interesting, because whenever you hear about violence and access to guns, it's about self-defense. But the dignity of the self-defense argument. So what was the liberal response to your argument? Hey, you got a good point. We see what you're talking about. And some of us liberals now are opening a new page on how we view the gun rights debate. Is that what you heard?
Well, I'm trying. It takes a while for, people to read the essay. It's a pretty recent essay. Then hopefully people are responding to it. And then that's going through the, peer review system, and that takes time. Most philosophy, journals are very difficult to publish in. Like this journal that I published this one in, it probably has like a 95% rejection rate. So you usually have to send an essay to multiple journals before you get it accepted. So it takes years often to get an essay accepted. So hopefully it's going to, get some response from, whoever. But it's, yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, people's views about guns, I think, are changing on the left.
Really?
I mean, I think like you're hearing more noise from people on the left in favor of guns with like the BLM movement. More saying like, well, look, I mean, disenfranchised groups have a right to, I mean, an earlier, I have a, like one leftist professor did cite some earlier thoughts in this direction that I expressed positively in a paper where he was defending gun rights on behalf of oppressed groups. So, from a dignitarian sort of perspective.
Sure.
So, I think we will see this more. I think I'm on Twitter way too much. I just lurk. But I'm hearing people I'm hearing some people who were formerly against gun rights saying, does this Hamas attack present us with a new argument for people having guns? Like if more Israelis were armed, and they are pretty armed compared to.
They're one of the most armed countries on the world outside of Switzerland.
But I mean, if they were like
new levels of armament no one's ever seen in life.
So if like more of them were like strapped on a, just home carry or whatever, would, so does this present some sort of new argument for people who are under threat? There's also like when you look at the gun control literature, and this is not a criticism philosophically, this is just a rhetorical criticism. This is a sociological criticism, but it doesn't hold up with like post 2020 memeplex. Like they're like, well, we have police to protect you. Like people after 2020 don't want to hear that as much. There's so much mistrust of the police. There was this case where in this happened just a week ago, maybe you saw it, where where'd this happen? Was it in California? There was a shooting. It was a black area. Police tried to go into the area and they didn't let the white cop in. They told the white cop he couldn't come into the area. And you can find this. And so there's like, where the gun control stuff is like, well, it's like the police's job to protect, which it isn't even their job. Like this, the Supreme Court has said multiple times, appellate courts have said multiple times, it's literally not the job of police to protect you.
And they should stop putting it on their doors and signs. And
so they literally don't have that job, let alone people don't do their job.
Like, right? Yeah, and that's not what they say.
Yeah, and it's an impossible job. And so talking about, well, you want the government and police to have a monopoly of force. It just is sounding worse and worse. People, especially like horseshoe theory is real. A lot of the maybe really progressive leftists are so suspicious of police and so suspicious of the government at this point that they actually are probably warming up to the idea of citizens having guns.
Interesting. I remember with the BLM protests, there was a group called I'm not going to say their name correctly intentionally, the Not Effing Around group. Effing did not mean fun. It was a different word. But they said, hey, if all these right-wing people can dress up in military gear with fully automatic machine guns and walk around a park saying, hey, I'm just protecting my rights, we can too.
Yep.
And then they had 60 black people in full garb and machine gun. And interesting. It was I had never seen that before. And they were saying, hey, you could have guns and vests and everything. Why can't we? And I was like, there really isn't a reason why you can't. If we let other people say, hey, I want to have my rights, and I need to have a machine gun strapped to my back with a bulletproof vest so that I can go into McDonald's and drink a cup of coffee for half an hour, which I have seen people do, then they have the right to do that too.
Right.
I want to ask you about, I'm sorry.
Oh, since 2020, like, I think the left is warming up a little bit towards guns.
Okay.
And I think since 2020 also, the right is like the arguments, the paradigmatic case in which you would need a gun was, the idea was, well, it's a criminal or two breaking into your house, maybe, right? But we weren't really thinking a lot about riots. And in 2020, it seemed like, oh, like there's like whole days where police won't come in. Police are depolicing, since, because of the Ferguson effect. So police are depolicing. We could have police sort of surrendering the streets to rioters. You're watching scenes in South Africa, in the Durban riots going on as well. And it's like, so there's like, it isn't just like fighting a criminal or two, or protecting yourself from a criminal or two, or maybe fighting the government, which is a whole other, a whole other interesting thing to talk about.
Sure.
But also like civic unrest and riots, which, and you can't control civic unrest with handguns either, by the way, right? Like you absolutely need semi-automatic rifles for that. And so, and that the possibility of that is just real. Okay. So I think the conversation has changed, and we are entering a new sort of epic with respect to, the gun rights debate.
Interesting. Because for years it has been the left railing against guns. I remember had multiple school shootings, and then CNN would have a town hall, and they had every kid in America go on there, and we need to have guns, and they need to be banned, and headlines during President Obama's time to get rid of guns. And then you had, I think it was James Claiborne out of South Carolina, who led the nomination, which was the only one that he got for Biden in a primary during the race, said most people that he had found on the left don't care about gun rights. And he was shocked to see that, but they just don't. They don't care about privacy. They don't care about gun rights. So that was 2 years ago. So it's interesting to hear that the left's warming up. They really took a different stance just 2 years ago. I mean, BLM, right? Let's burn down, 22 cities on fire. I'm sure mostly peaceful protests, but Kyle Rittenhouse took a gun to BLM protest. The stance of BLM was guns bad. I'm here in California. Every lefty in America said that. So what an incredible change.
Well, but they had guns. I mean, like who's that Gage Gross? Anyway, the guy who Rittenhouse blew his bicep off.
Yeah.
I mean, he had a gun, right? I
Sure.
mean, he had a handgun on him. So, they're carrying guns too. And so it's just, I mean, it's just a matter of time. I mean, the more that it becomes a revolutionary movement, a revolutionary decolonization movement or whatever, the more, you're going to hear, I think, pro-gun sort of noises.
Let me ask you about this. I found this very interesting. It was kind of a topic that I had talked with your, I believe, colleague, Professor Michael Humer. And what did you, but I don't want to preface it or anything. What did you mean by this? If you want to advance a conservative thesis in an academic journal, you have to be careful and mount an argument based upon principles. And I capitalized it, but I heard the word they feel. Professor, let me push back. I have heard that academia is a pure search for the truth, and that every academic goes through bias training so that they learn to check their biases and not be biased. Therefore, we can assume every university is unbiased and there is no bias against conservative thought. Totally correct, right?
Yeah. No, there isn't. I mean, I don't know. I never had any sort of bias training other than a sort of diversity, equity, inclusion type training. That's the only bias training that I've ever received. I've never gotten formally or informally trained to try to be unbiased.
Wow.
Well, I mean, that's not all bad in the sense that like an adversarial model might be the correct model for perpetuating the truth. Like, so, so it may be that more truth comes out when you just have groups of people disagreeing a lot, all of whom are biased. But, you just have some Robert's rules, or you have some sort of structure that falls into where the audience and the next generation watching can see, okay, well, who's making the best arguments?
Sure.
But so it isn't like I'm suggesting that professors be unbiased, but or have slants or opinions or whatever. I mean, of course, as a professor teaching, that's different than a professor as a scholar. But the problem is that what I do want, though, is more intellectual diversity. Not just diversity for diversity's sake. I mean, it's not like every sort of super fringe view needs to be represented in the universities, but something is out of whack when major ideologies are not represented at all in certain fields. Insofar as, say, American conservatives or people who tend to vote in that direction are about half the population, and maybe 1 out of 200 or 300 sociologists vote Republican, which doesn't even mean they're conservative, then you're just not going to have that sort of, there's no adversarial system there. I mean, anyone who's on the right or conservative or not that I like care about this badge being on the right, and I'm really more of a traditionalist than a conservative, but there's just the rules are made by all the gatekeepers, etc., are all on the left, and so I have to navigate within that information.
Thank you for saying that.
Ecology.
I've heard this story a couple other times, and since my journey investigating political polarization 6 months ago, I find it disturbing for this reason. Every political scientist basically agrees it's all the Republicans' fault and the Democrats didn't do anything. Here's all these studies. 99% of them are published by Democrats. Hey, half of America that's conservative, you should totally buy this. Yeah. That'll never work. That will never work. They will never buy it. They will never buy. We're all bad guys because 99% of the university system's biased against us and nobody has our opinion. That's going to fall dead flat. Yeah. And yet,
I mean, you've seen
how do we fix America?
Yeah, you've seen the stats where like trust in the universities is just collapsed among.
Yeah. How do we fix? Let's say some scientist, some professor comes up with the solution to fix polarization in America, and 50% of the country says, "I don't believe you, and I'm not going to do it because you guys are so biased." So even if we have the solution, we can't implement it because half of our population says no. Is that a good situation to be in, Professor, or a super horrible situation to be in?
Yeah, it's a bad situation. And I don't, at this stage, I don't even know if like having more conservative professors would help. Like,
wow.
I mean, well, because I don't know, the fight might just transfer, just continue on into the universities. I mean, right. Because there's just not enough common ground. We're just dealing with maybe we're getting to the stage where there's just not enough perhaps common ground or, left. But they, I mean, a situation in which, okay, like even if you waved the magic wand and had like half of the professorate, like, or had some sort of political, you had a professor that was representative of the actual population when it comes to politics, even if you had that. then you just have a situation where those on the left would only listen to the leftist professors, and those on the right would only listen to the rightist professors. And I don't know if things would be any better as far as getting rid of polarization, but you might get better scholarship if they have, there's some interesting, there are some professors there are plenty of professors on the left who are intellectually curious, who want to hear, they're bored with just listening to everyone agree, especially philosophers. We like to argue. And so I absolutely know some professors on the left who will listen to me and listen to others just because they want to hear something new.
Sure.
And so there would be some of that. And from that, progress can be made. I think this sort of adversarial collaboration, you're starting to see some papers being written in the social sciences, not so much philosophy as far as I know, although hopefully it will start, but collaboration, like you write the same paper between two people who disagree. Right. So it's not even a debate paper. It's like we're trying to advance one thing, but we came to these conclusions as adversaries. That stuff could be very interesting, and hopefully more of that will happen. But there are so many professors who don't even want to be associated with the wrong thinker, who they hold them in like such deep contempt morally, that they don't want to be sullied by even talking to them. They don't want their reputation to be besmirched by even talking to them. They are viewed as traitors to their, when they retreat back to their friends or go to their cocktail parties or whatever, they're viewed with suspicion by their more radical friends for even talking to, right? So, I mean, I deal with this literally as on my own campus, right? And there are just so many people terrified, like, professors are a shockingly cowardly group of people. And so they're just terrified of any controversy, even if they're curious or whatever. And that's why every conservative professor you talk to, if you ask them this question, they're going to tell you this. They're going to say, if you ask them, tell me about the people who send you direct messages, right? And they will tell you stories about high profile thinkers and adjuncts alike being like, oh, I like that tweet, or I like that post, or I agreed with, what your point here, but, it's crazy, but, I'm not going to say anything publicly. Like, we all know this, like any professor that managed somehow by some miracle accident to get a position knows this. So there's this like huge terrified group of professors who can't engage just because they're, conflict averse. So you kind of got to not be conflict averse.
Conflict averse, but also concerned about your livelihood. I mean, we live in the times where people lose their job and tenure does not protect them because people got emotionally upset at something that they said. Not that it was factually incorrect. They just didn't like it. And now you're gone. Your reputation's destroyed and you're ruined. That has happened at Harvard all the way down to Stanford. So there's a lot of people who don't want to ruin. I've worked in this field for 20 to 30 years. How about you ruin your reputation and your retirement and your career to say something you think is important, but nobody else does? I don't know many people who are willing to trash their livelihood and their ability to stay employed to do the right thing. It's a tough call. Also, I thought the university systems were these things where you could get tenure and then you could say what you want within reason, and they could never do that. And now it looks like that's gone. That is not a real thing anymore. Maybe on paper, but
yeah, I am very fortunate to be. All right, so I absolutely, and no one I know was thinking about this in 2009 when I went on the job market and luckily got a job. Nobody in 2009 was saying, well, if you really want to be protected by tenure, steer away from private colleges. Like, we assume like whether it's private or public made no difference. And you know what? You probably get paid better at a lot of private schools. So those are plum positions. Now I am so glad to be at a public university because there are it's harder to fire a professor for expressing political views at a public university than a private one, because they sort of enjoy some free speech protections by public employees that private that professors at private universities don't have. So that's a wonderful thing. But even if you keep your job, like there's a bunch of ways that they get you. Like it's not fun to be ghosted in the hallways. It's not fun to the point where like when you're on a committee, if you express a view, even if it has nothing to do with politics whatsoever, it's just like people are going to be against the view because it's you. Getting grants becomes harder. So you could just stop getting grants. And a lot of, especially in the sciences and social sciences, they live on grants. Another thing is that almost all professors want a better job than they have. So, they're very ambitious in trying to climb up this sort of status hierarchy of institutions. And, they're applying for jobs where it's like, well, 400 people have applied for this job. Okay. And probably, no matter how good you are, probably about 50 are just as good. All right. And no dean is going to want to hire you, even if magically you found a hiring committee that was okay with you after you've been canceled, which would be a minor miracle. I mean, you'd have to be basically friends with the whole committee. But the dean is just going to Google you, see what you got canceled for, right? I swear Google puts that stuff high up on the search results too, right? It seems like the canceling, the algorithm seems to like that canceling stuff. So, they're just going to be like, well, there are 49 other people that have no deans. Why are you bringing this person that, some students are going to complain about, right? We don't need another teach-in. We don't need a sit-in. We don't need any students banging a drum coming into the classroom and can't you just hire someone who, right? And so, so there, all that is costly, and tenure doesn't touch that, right? Tenure doesn't help you get another job,
right?
A better job,
right? So once you get canceled at one university, you're effectively canceled from academia.
Yeah, okay. And most professors can't do anything else that can make money. Right. Especially like in the humanities, right? So it's like that, or what? You're going to be technical writing, or you're going to, you got to learn how to code, if that. And so it's the only thing you could do. So it turns out all this talk, this rhetoric that they loved patting themselves on the back about, free thought and speaking truth to power, the most comedic phrase, which I don't know how anyone could even say that with a straight face anymore. All that turned out to be, gossamer. It means absolutely nothing when rubber hits the road. As soon as the wrong ideology wanted the same sort of, dissident rights, they were not afforded it. So that's the situation we're in.
I get it. And that's something that I had come to during this research. And I was kind of shocked by that, that there seems to be almost no conservatives in the social sciences represented. And I'm finding most of the people who work in polarization have come to the conclusion that it's all the Republicans' faults and the Democrats have done nothing wrong at all. Or if they did, it's like a tiny amount. And then the Republicans did this much. And so when we're looking at polarization and why are we polarized? Well, it's a little bit these guys, and then it's this much these guys. And then I'll ask them, okay, Donald Trump saying stop the steal and I'm really president and Biden isn't, wrong, bad. Of course. What about Hillary Clinton and the Democrats saying Russia rigged the election for 3 to 4 years and that's completely disproven? And yet none of them can say anything about that. I have liberal friends who go, yeah, I know there's a report and I know it was by the Justice Department and I know it disproved it, but I still kind of believe it's true that he did that, even though there's no evidence after 4 different investigations. And I'm going to hold that belief. And I go, what's the difference between you and Trump? Multiple investigations disproved. I don't trust any of those investigations. I trust my heart when it comes to facts about the other side. What's the difference between that and what Donald Trump said? How do we know that in his heart, he really doesn't believe that he won the election? He may in his heart. I don't think he won. I think that's silly. But now we're going to judge intent of someone's perspective. Ridiculous. It reminds me of the thought police last seen by the Japanese Imperial Army in 1939. Another ridiculous concept. And then there was a LA Times article that came out 2 weeks ago where a professor said, I had to curtail my findings. I've had a lot of research and I could have said 5 different things. I only said 1 because the other 4 conclusions would not be popular and I wanted to make sure that I got published. And he wrote that in an LA Times article. That's massively exploded in controversy. What do you mean you couldn't just say what the truth was and there might be bias? And then there's a ton of liberal professors saying, this guy's lying, he's making this up, there's nothing like this at all. And yet he seems like a kind of trustworthy guy. And it didn't seem like he was trying to cause a problem. He didn't even say that out loud. It was kind of like buried in some back statement. It just kind of got boiled to the top of this debate. Where he's going, look, I wanted to get published. 4 of these things they didn't want to hear. So I said the one they would be okay with. Guess what happened? I got published. Shocker. But then the public hears, hold on, we were denied 75% of the conclusions you could have made based upon science because of politics? That's not science. That's not a university system we want to pay for with our tax dollars. What's going on? And there seems to be a break between the public's perception of the university and what the universities are saying they're actually doing. And that just seems to get wider and wider with time. I was interested in talking with you because I've heard this from other people. And I find it very disturbing. America is deeply polarized. We need solutions. And I'm horrified by the idea that we may actually find solutions and then half the crowd says, I'm out. I don't trust you. I don't trust your solution for cancer because I don't like your doctor. So I'll take a risk and do some home therapies. And maybe I die from cancer, maybe I don't, but I don't trust your doctor. And then we're going to end with dead people who die from cancer when they could have saved themselves. That's what I'm afraid of. Sorry. No,
literally the shape of the earth has been politicized,
Right. Well, I'm not a big fan of Trump. He made my mom cry. She's Mexican. He said we're all rapists. At the same time, I was told only Trump does fake news. Only Trump does fake news. Then Joseph Biden comes in and says, week 1, there was no vaccine before him here. Straight up lie. Then this week he says he knew Golda Meir, talking about the Hamas thing. Oh, I was there with Golda Meir. Straight up lie. Then there was another thing where they said, oh, it's not inflation, even though it's 2 executive quarters with rising prices, which has been the definition of inflation going back, I believe, to Adam Smith. And they said, no, that's just not it. And I have a lot of liberal friends who believe that. I'm going, that's a total and complete lie. We've known that's not true for centuries. You have half the country who's not conservative believing it. Is that a good sign that we've our country that's realized the problem with fake news, or a bad sign, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been a very revealing couple years.
Okay. Sorry. Let me ask you about this other study. Questioning the assumptions of moralism, universalism, and interpretive dominance in racist monuments debates. This essay questions 3 widespread assumptions in monuments debates in terms of moralism, universalism, interpretive dominance. Roughly, moralism assumes that the memorials should only be good to people or good causes. Universalism holds that memorials should represent or be for the whole polity or its real or supposed corporate values. Interpretive dominance maintains that when faced with monuments with reasonably qualifying and disqualifying interpretations, policy should respond to the disqualifying ones. The assumptions do not settle the debates between removalists and preservationists, but they do make the removal position easier to defend. Various counterexamples of these assumptions, real and imagined, motivate competing positions. I term sentimentalism, particularism, and interpretive independence. What is the debate on the monuments, roughly?
Yeah. So
yeah.
Right. This paper, like, so I'm probably I'm almost certainly the most pro-preservationist philosopher when it comes to monuments. Okay. I mean, in print. Okay.
Okay.
And, but for this paper, I tried to step back and I tried to write something that would help everybody, no matter where they stand on the issue, think better about the issue by talking about these three ways that these three dimensions, okay, to help us be more consistent when we talk about monuments. All right. So like a lot of people who are against Confederate monuments are against Confederate monuments because they're moralists, which by that I mean they say, look, that monument shouldn't stay up. If you're thinking about a monument to somebody, it shouldn't go up. It's disqualifying. If the person being memorialized is a bad person, okay, so that's moralism. And they're like, well, they're racist or they fought for some racist cause, so therefore, a monument should go up to it. And I'm like, well, is that true? So then I like just point to a bunch of monuments that I never hear any of my progressive friends complain about, like a monument to Genghis Khan. All right, so the Mongols have been putting up all these the Mongolians have been putting up all these monuments to Genghis Khan since, they got their sort of independence from communism since the 90s, right? And Mongolia is going through this sort of nationalistic phase, and they're reaching back to Genghis Khan, and they're like, well, he was pretty badass. I mean, say what you want about him, but he's pretty badass and he's ours, right? And so they just built this, and you could look it up. I mean, it's like this stainless steel 140-foot statue of Genghis Khan on his horse, right? Probably the world's biggest like killer of people, right? I mean, like he actually, like, the world got colder because he killed so many people. All right, that the like forests grew over farms. So like I never hear them complain about Genghis Khan monuments. I never hear them complain about, like, all right, Shaka Zulu statues. They're putting up statues to Shaka Zulu in South Africa. Okay. Never hear them complain about that. Now here's an interesting, this isn't me just saying like those statues should go down too. No, I think those statues should stay up. I think that's fine. Like, have statues to Genghis Khan, have statues to Shaka Zulu, who was by the way, colonialist. I mean, he was a conqueror, colonialist conqueror that displaced millions and killed millions. Have statues to him. That's fine, because I'm not what's called a moralist. I'm what I call a sentimentalist, right? So on my theory of why we put up monuments to whoever we put up monuments to, it's sort of like the logic of why you put up pictures in your house to who you put pictures up in your house. Like let me just ask you, like, suppose you had a grandfather who was good to you, whatever. He was good to you. He bounced you on his knee or whatever. He also, at one point in his life, killed somebody for like a stupid reason. Like, he killed somebody because he was like robbing them for drug money. All right. Okay. Would you not put up his picture, or because he did that? Just wondering. I mean, honestly, what's your intuition on that? Would you not put up a picture to your grandfather because he was a murderer?
Well, that's a tough one. If it was me personally, if it was a super horrible, like ridiculously horrible murder, no, I wouldn't put it up. If it was, he got into a shootout with a fellow rancher over cattle or something Western, yeah, I would.
Okay.
Because that's,
right. So that's fine. Right. That's what this paper is about, like helping people figure out how moralistic versus sentimentalist they are. Like, I bet, I haven't done a study, but like, I bet that the children of murderers have their pictures up on their wall. Like, I bet the vast majority of people who are murderers, their family has their picture up somewhere on their mantle. And that's because like for a lot of us, what we put up on our walls are governed by a logic of sentiment, which isn't much of a logic at all. It really has to do with a lot of quirky psychological reasons why you might memorialize somebody in your house. And but what isn't really important when you think about how you decorate your house is like the morality of the of this person versus that person. So what nations do much more reliably than any moralistic logic is they're basically using monuments and memorials in this sentimentalist rationale. They meant a lot to us. We put up monuments to defeats and victories, so because it was like meaningful to us or meaningful to part of us, right? And that this gets to another dimension. Like sometimes when people criticize Confederate monuments, they're like, well, they fought America. Why would you put up a monument in America to someone who fought America? And that's suggesting this universalism, like, well, if you have a monument to somebody, it has to represent the entirety of the country. And but we don't really think that when it comes to other things. Like we have monuments to Black liberationists that are kind of like for more of the Black population or meaningful to the Black population. All right. Martin Luther King, we'll name some street Martin Luther King Drive in a Black area, not a white area. We have literal monuments to Indians who died massacring American soldiers in Little Bighorn. Okay. And those are like new monuments that are coming up. Sure. Most people think it's fine, right? I think it's fine because I'm not a universalist. I'm a particularist. I think it's okay that you have a monument. By the way, right, these Native Americans, and I'm not saying anything against them at all when I say this, but by the way, they were fighting for an ethno state or an ethno country, right, or whatever territory.
True, and protecting their land.
They weren't fighting for liberal multiculturalism. They were fighting
but they were fighting for their land.
So and they're fighting America. So
who invaded their land?
Right, exactly. So like we have no problem putting up monuments to particular groups, and right. So if you're okay with that, then that's going to speak in favor of, again, it doesn't settle the issue, but it makes it, if particularism is legitimate and you could have monuments that only represent part of the people, not the whole people, then okay, that's a point that makes Confederate monuments easier to defend. Now, this is a dead argument because like all the Confederate monuments are being taken down. Like there's practically none left. Right. The next, the moralistic argument is going to hit, and also this, what I call interpretive dominance. I mean, the next thing is the founding fathers, of course. And I was saying this from the beginning. Mm-hmm. I wrote one of the first papers on this issue. I said, there's no way that you can argue. You're not going to be able to argue consistently that, okay, yeah, we take down, monuments to Robert E. Lee and that, Jefferson is not next. Of course, Jefferson is next. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, it isn't like enslaving black people is bad, and then like conquering a nation, conquering an entire continent, and taking all the land of the people that were there is okay. Like, of course that's going to come up.
Right.
so
Right.
Now then people are saying, oh, no, see, the monuments for George Washington or the monuments for Jefferson or so forth, those mean something different, right? Those are about the freedom, and whereas a monument for Lee isn't, right? And so
That's not true at all.
right? So then you have this question about like, does that matter? Because again, like there's a lot to say there, but monuments can be interpreted. Any piece of art can be interpreted many ways. Any sentence can be interpreted many ways, and we need to figure out that just because a monument can have an interpretation that's disqualifying, like a monument to evil, if it also has a reasonable interpretation that's qualifying, like, okay, yeah, you can interpret it as being for this bad thing or interpret it for being for this good thing. All right, why is it that we always treat the monument as if in accordance to that it has a negative interpretation when it could also have the good interpretation? When we talk to each other, like, this is something that philosophers always bang on about. Like, we're supposed to have this principle of charity, right? So when you give an argument or when you say something, I'm supposed to try to understand that in the best light possible. I'm supposed to try to understand you as being well motivated, and I'm going to try to interpret your argument so it's not like I'm not straw manning you. Okay,
right.
Well, these monuments can, we could apply this same, the same sort of principle of charity for these monuments as well, and we don't. People are like, well, look, when I look at this monument, I'm not thinking about like, let's bring back slavery or something like that. I'm thinking about, wow, my ancestors or my culture heroes did some great things and whatever, and they were they're in a sense fighting for their homeland, and they represent a set of values that I do care about. No one takes that seriously, and so but then they look at some other monument and they're much more charitable. We're not consistent about this, and so we have to just be more. We have to be more consistent about the messiness of monuments and the reasonable ambiguity in what monuments mean.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I remember the Confederate monument debate, and I am on the side of bringing the monuments down. However, I pointed out to my fellow liberals, this is a little bit hypocritical, right? Because Abraham Lincoln okayed the expansion into the plains, which led to the genocide of the Plains Indians underneath the general that he personally appointed. He also executed more natives in one sitting than any president ever. And George Washington literally committed a genocide against some of the native tribes in the surrounding area. There's a speech where he says we have to wipe them out completely, men, women, children. It's a conscious genocide. Also, so that's not good. Then we can go on to, my favorite was when Barack Obama visited Mount Rushmore, and CNN covered it widely. Look how great, his face should be on Mount Rushmore because America has this racist past and we need to get past it. And I go, well, that's kind of interesting because Mount Rushmore is on the sacred land, I think, of the Black Hills Sioux. It was their top symbol of who they are. And then we put the faces of white men on it to look down on the remaining reservations so that they would know that they were conquered. That's why that monument's designed that way. It's a monument to white supremacy, conquering and letting brown-skinned people know you have been conquered and we own you. That's why it faces, that's why it's in that particular position, and that's why it faces the direction that it is. Most people don't cover that. Obama said nothing. So I'm like, oh, we need to get past slavery, which we do, but I guess we don't need to talk about genocide and that we celebrate genocide. Also, Roosevelt, as a Latino, I got to tell you, as an educated Latino, Roosevelt basically set up the policy for the subjugation of Latin America, the invasion of every single country in Latin America, and the resulting century of poverty and torment and horror. My family had to come here because Mexico was destabilized. I remember asking my abuelita, why are there so many Latinos here? And she goes, because America invaded every country and destabilized it. Now you can't live there. Roosevelt is still celebrated. So we celebrate Washington, we celebrate Lincoln, we celebrate Roosevelt. This is disgusting to indigenous people and disgusting to Latin people. And yet African-American community says nothing. Is that justice? Or maybe it's, like you said, particular justice. I'm not really concerned about you as long as my group gets justice, and I'll use the word justice to get it. But it's not really justice. It's justice for just my group. It's not justice for everybody.
So would you be for like sort of eradicating, full on iconoclasm of all those monuments to founders? And
I'm a universalist. So I'm like, if you make a standard, you apply it across the board. So if lying about elections is wrong, Trump goes to prison and Hillary goes to prison. That makes me no friends in the liberal group. Okay. Or you just let it go and no one goes to prison. So if we're going to do it, we do it all the way. If we're not going to do it, then we let them all go. So if we're not going to tear down statutes that insult Latin people, insult indigenous, then tear down none of the Confederate statues. Nobody gets anything. Or if we are going to do that, then let's really do it. What I see right now is, let's tear these down, but let's not even have a conversation about these, which were just as horrible. Why? Because it doesn't affect our group and our groups in power. For me, it says everything. Indigenous people are 1 to 2% of the national population. African Americans are 13%. They're well represented in DC. They had a presidency. Indigenous have none of those things. So when I look at who's getting what they want and who doesn't, I'm thinking, demographics, institutionalization, a presidency, the ability to be represented and have agency and power in Washington, D.C., and none of those things. Who gets what they want and who doesn't? My favorite thing was when they had the, I think it was the people from Haiti coming across the border, and the border guards were whipping them, which is wrong. And every African-American legislator in Washington, D.C. came out within 2 weeks. This is wrong. Shut down this border. We cannot have Black people being whipped, which we can't and should not. What I never heard any of the legislators say was, these people had been using for whips for years. It was just on Latin people. No one in America complained then. Not a word. Not until it was African-skinned people, and then it was a national issue. And yet we knew they used the whips for years before. No one in America could say anything. So that's how I view it. Let's either do it all or don't do it all, and just admit you're a hypocrite. Or if you're really about it, let's get them all. And we don't ever do that in America.
So faced with that choice, would you rather take them all down or leave them all up?
I don't have an opinion on that. I'm very much, if you're going to do it, be fair and across the board about it, or don't do it. I don't like hypocrisy. I don't like double standards. I don't like double speak. I really don't like you pointing the finger at somebody else and saying you did that when you yourself did the exact same thing and you just don't want to bring it up because it's inconvenient. That really bothers me. So let's just be across the board. I don't have a dog in that hunt, but what we're doing right now is, this is bad for me. I could care less about you guys, but I'm going to call this justice for the country, even though it really just benefits just me. That's garbage. That's not justice. That's not justice how Martin Luther King Jr. defined it. That's not justice how John F. Kennedy defined it. Both of them said, justice too long denied for others is justice denied for all.
Well, probably the guide, like South Africa is like a leading indicator for a lot of this stuff when it comes to monuments and decolonization. And my position is very Mandelian. So everyone expected when when South Africa democratized, everyone expected that there'd be mass removal of all the Afrikaner monuments. And Nelson Mandela basically told them no.
Interesting. What was his reasoning?
Social cohesion. Mandela was very savvy. He grew up in a literal tribe, and he was very savvy about tribal allegiances and irrational biases, and and what holds people together. And he said, they're villains to us, but they're heroes to the white South Africans. And if we're going to keep this thing on the rails, right, which is what he wanted to do, you got to leave their monuments up. And a lot of some of them are coming down now because Mandela's sort of that sort of ethos is slowly eroding. Okay,
I've seen that.
Kind of quickly eroding.
I've
but
seen that.
Like, there are still like absolutely monuments and statues to white South Africans all over the place, right on Capitol grounds, right in the Union buildings, right. So the philosophy was, we don't tear down, we add. Okay, we don't tear down, we add. So like, I give this analogy, like, suppose, going back to this domestic analogy, suppose that you're an interracial, or there's like an interracial marriage, okay, and or just a marriage, right? And one partner's, and so you buy a new house together, right? And and one partner has pictures from his family and, so forth, and heirlooms, and, oh, this has been my family for 300 years and it looks awesome and all this. And the other partner, like, all their stuff got burned down in fire. Like,
okay.
Yeah, right?
Okay.
Now you would say, that the partner that has a lot of representation of his family's history in that house needs to find ways to compensate for that, right? Needs to find ways to okay, what's meaningful to your family? Like, we really got to look for any sort of heritage that we could start representing, so our kids together can see that you have two, you come from two families, right? And that your family existed, right? And so the Mandelian philosophy is, the monuments to Afrikaners stay, and monuments to, but there has to be, more monuments to Black culture heroes, okay? Including, right, and it's not a monolith, because like, these are all different tribes that literally fought each other, right? So you have like, you have like indigenous South Africans, like the Khoi and the San, who like were absolutely displaced by Zulus, okay?
Right.
But the Zulu statues go up, Khoisan statues go up, like, statue, and like right next to each other.
Yeah.
Okay. Enemies. Okay, but their statues will go up right next to each other, right? And right next to a white one. That, that was Mandela's view, that everyone's culture heroes, have to get honored, have to be represented. Of course, we knew they fought. Of course, we know that if any of them were alive today, they'd be like, how can you dare live with these people? And, they're like, so suppose like you have interracial marriage where the parents of both or one were opposed to the marriage because they were, race against them. Well, what do you do? Like, either, this depends how tribalistic you are. I don't know what your, moral psychology is. I don't know what your political psychology is, but for those of us who are more like kind of tribalistic in our sensibilities, as am I, those pictures of those racist family members still go up. All right.
Sure.
Our children have to feel proud of their ancestors on both sides, even though those ancestors would be against the marriage. And, if you can't do that, then like, don't get married, then don't get married. Right. So if you can't raise your kids to feel proud of their ancestors, or they have to demonize half their ancestors, like, you find another mate, or, not to, to go back into your, then secede and have two separate states, so that whatever. But this idea of, oh, we're going to get married, even though like I hate your whole, you marry the family.
Sure.
You marry the family. And if you can't, if you don't make your kids hate half their family, So anyway, that was Mandela's solution. I think it's the best way. Look, I think every year that goes by, people are becoming less and less optimistic about multiracial societies being sustainable.
Fair enough.
But if you're going to keep, like, I trust Mandela more on this issue than anybody else. Okay, his instincts were by far the best proven. No one thought South Africa, right? The doomsayers were like, South Africa's going to fall apart. They're going to genocide the whites right away. They're whatever. People were kind of waiting, and he kept that thing going, right? And so I trust him more than, frankly, philosophers when it comes to keeping a multiracial society with a lot of racial grievance together. And I think his instincts were perfectly correct. Fair. And that's what I'm for. Keep the statues up, add more monuments to honor the groups that haven't been honored enough in the country. That's the best I think we could do. It's nothing's easy, but I think people are way less radicalized by watching new monuments go up than watching monuments that are kind of more or less effigies of their people go down. I think, not to get weird with you, but please. Like,
we want to hear it. We want to hear it. That's why we do these shows.
I haven't talked about this in print, but like, monuments and statues and all these things can be thought of as sort of social technologies. Okay, so like, they're canaries in the coal mine. You put up a monument somewhere and see if it stays. See if it stays up. If you put up a monument somewhere and to some value or to someone who is important to your people, and it stays up, that means that value or those people are pretty safe for the time being. But people will tear down a monument before they genocide you, right? So put up monuments so you know if your ass is next, right? Because it's like warning, like, let me know, right? Or put up a monument before you show up to see if you're going to be welcome if you show up. If you put up a monument there and they tear it down next day, then you know, like, well, I'm not going to even show up there, right? So, monuments are social technologies, and people are like, we get it. When you take down that monument, we know what's coming next. And so, like, a lot of people, a lot of white people are watching these monuments go down, and they're like feeling like things are going to get spicy here for us if you keep taking down our monuments. Mandela knew this, okay? And he's like, that's why we're not taking down the monuments. South Africa would fall apart without its whites in 1994, okay? Obviously. And he knew that. He needed the whites on board. He needed the whites to stay. And so he wasn't going to make them feel afraid by having their monuments taken down.
Right.
And this is not even... This is like the most realpolitik interpretation. Like, this is the least generous interpretation. It's still very wise. Okay. I mean, insofar as he really wanted to build, like, look, they're our brothers now. We're all moving forward together. And of course, we're all married now, and every partner gets their ancestors, all that sort of highfalutin stuff. Maybe he believed that too. But just in terms of like pure politics, it was smart. That's what I'm suggesting.
Lenin did the same thing with Lenin.
Oh, right.
Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, when he led the communist revolution that took over the country, a lot of his peers said, let's get rid of all the industrialists, right? They made us bad. And Lenin said, no, you'll collapse the country. We have to allow some industrialists, some capitalists to work here so that we can have a modern state. He did not allow all of them to be wiped out. He did get himself into a lot of trouble with his fellow political peers, but he did it for the same reason Mandela did. He knew it would collapse the country. There's no point to having a revolution. We're free and our country sucks and we can't do anything. That's not success. I get you. I get what you're saying about Mandela. He was definitely a founding father of his nation. I'll just leave it as I understand. I could be wrong. Many of the South African statues were made over time, while the South African government was in control and had an apartheid state. And then Mandela came out and said, let's add it to. As I understand, a lot of the Southern monuments were not built during the Civil War. They were not built after the Civil War, which would have been to national healing. They were built in the 50s and 60s and 70s, around the same time as the Civil Rights Movement and people coming from the North to register people to vote and being executed because they were Jews and blacks. And so there's some concern that, why did you make the monuments not during the Civil War, not after the Civil War when we're trying to come to a country, but during the 50s and 60s when you have racial upheaval for the first time in 100 years and you start executing people who are black and Jewish? Kind of weird that you did that right at that time. That's what a lot of people say. So they didn't, in fact, happen at the historical event. They happened almost a century later. And some people say maybe your motives weren't actually about the event because you waited a century to do it. As I understand, that did not happen that way in South Africa. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't know about the South African situation as much. I guess, it was organic and probably not done out of political insecurity. I know the ADL has pushed this line a lot, that what the Civil War monuments are about is anti, they were basically like sort of politicized for Jim Crow. I'm not persuaded. So first of all, to establish this, I want to know when the statues and the monuments to Northerners went up, right? So like, and they never tell you that, right? So like, there's like, you look at when the monuments to Northerners, like my small town Wisconsin. My wife lives there, and they have a monument to Union soldiers that went up in the 20s.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a monument to, this is one, like during the BLM riots of 2020 in Madison, Wisconsin. The BLM protesters tore down a statue to a guy named Herman Hegg, I think, who actually was an abolitionist and died in, I forget where, Vicksburg, died fighting for the North. They ripped it down just because he was whatever, a white guy looking, like, I don't know, and ripped the statue down, ripped the head off, threw it in a lake. One so-called protester had it in his trunk. It turned out that guy was a multiple sex offender, whatever. But it's like that statue went up in the 20s. Now that statue thankfully has been put back up. But so yeah, like the Lee statue in Charlottesville, the guy who put that up had he went to Chicago. I mean, he grew up kind of poor. I think he moved to Chicago, made his fortune in the Chicago stock trade, came back, and he put the statue up as soon as he had kind of the money to put it up. He bought that park. He bought another park for blacks, by the way, and so the South was absolutely devastated after the war, and so it took a while. An interesting question that I think we need to ask is, why did the Northerners allow those statues to go up?
That's a great question.
And well, because it's because they're trying to heal this thing, right? And they understood, like, well, if you want to have a lasting relationship with a group of people, they have to have pride, and they have to feel like you're not trying to humiliate them.
Sure.
They're not going to be a partner. You may just totally destroy them, and if that's your goal, then fine. Yeah, rip down the monuments. But if you want them to actually be partners, or to integrate with them or whatever, then you cannot threaten their pride or their sense of identity.
Right.
And that goes all the way back to Lincoln's second inaugural address, and that was sort of the rationale. I mean, along with just not, whatever. So I think this idea, this Mendelian principle of you have to maintain pride, and you move together, you move closer together from a secure place where you feel safe, where you feel like your pride in your ancestors is going to be possible, and then let the marriage go from there.
Okay. Last question, one of my favorites. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this interview, and they've learned a lot about bias in academia, and maybe it's not all it's said, about different perspectives about guns that they've never heard of, different perspectives about monuments than they've ever heard of. But it's a week later, and they're struggling to remember everything that was covered in here. They knew it was a good interview, a lot of information they hadn't heard before, which is why we do this. But there was this one thing that the professor said, and it's 5 days after they watched this video, and they can't stop thinking about this one thing that you said. What is that one thought, Professor, you want people watching this to not be able to get out of their head 5 days after watching this interview?
Oh, well, I hope if they disagree with some particular policy, that they get curious about whether or not the reasons they hear for that policy are the best reasons. I think also that we need to be more open to the fact that, like, our values sometimes are quite dramatically different, but sometimes pretty similar, and actually the political tribalism can make you blind to the fact that when the ideas are even similar. So like, nice. Obviously different ideologies will see, people with different ideologies will see things different ways, but once it gets politicized, it could get to the point where it's like, well, they don't love their children, like something really ridiculous, right? And so, absolutely. So what I, am trying to do is, I guess, in both of these papers, is in these cases say, well, look, a lot of things that you do care about, like, say, dignity or political stability, or representation, those values could actually speak against some of the particular policies that got politicized and that you got worked up about because it just became identified as a red or blue tribe commitment.
That's very insightful, and there's a lot of that going on. Dignity, political stability, or representation. And I can completely, that's why we do the series.
Yeah, no, you're very admirable for doing that.
I thank you.
Channel. I just learned about you, and I've been watching some of your videos, and I'm like, I'm having a hard time placing this guy politically. I'm usually pretty good, and I'm like, what is this guy about? It's so it's more people have to do the things that you're doing, and I really appreciate it.
I wasn't even going to say where I stood on the issue till you asked me, and I only did because you asked, and I thought that was fair. But I really appreciate what you're saying. I work very hard to make people confused. I don't, well, on where I stand, not on the information. I hope the interviews are understood. I don't want people to go, well, what did Marcus say? I want them to watch the videos and go, I totally agree with what I thought before, or I didn't, or learned something new. You come up with whatever you think is right, because I don't see us doing this. I saw one interview after January 11th with NPR, and they interviewed 3 professors, and they said, well, it's mostly all Republicans' faults in social media. And then they go, holistic review done. We talked to 3 professors. And I'm like, that is the crappiest job you could do on one of the most consequential subjects facing the U.S. today. So, and no one else was doing it. So I said, fine, I'll do it. I'll interview different people, and I don't care what they say, and I'll present it unedited. And then the public can go, this is this or this is that. And one of the things I found was that I think there's a lot of great research I'm worried that no one or half the country is not going to follow it because there's so much bias in academia. It sees. I don't know how I could convince a Republican or a Trump supporter to listen to a strategy on how we're supposed to come together after telling them 99% of the academy is leftists who hate them. I just don't see how you're going to pull that off. And if you cannot get half the country in, we're not fixing anything. I mean, you don't fix the country with 50%. So if we don't get that other 50%, we're going nowhere fast, as my grandma used to say.
Yeah. I will say that, like, it is interesting being a member of the tribe that I am, that my people have learned a lot of, horseshoe theory again is real. Like, we are very aware now of what it's like to be second class, where we didn't know that before. Where we understand systemic bias and structures that are kind of set up to make you lose. We have learned that is real. We've learned about being natives and colonized in a sense. We feel that way now. And so so like there's this weird thing happening where it's like, oh, like
full circle.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. There's a lot of learning going on, or should be, going on. Yeah, it's yeah.
Would you ever be willing to come back?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely.
I love this interview.
Oh,
I love it when people challenge my thoughts. I love it when people say interesting things I never heard. It's kind of boring when you get 15 people and they all say the same thing every step of the way. It's nice to go, well, listen, like some of the stuff you said I never heard before. I consider that a good show. The whole point is to educate people. Like, hey, we said apples are better than oranges 15 times in a row. How's that educating people? This guy thinks apples are better than kiwis. Never heard that before. That's a good show. Now people are having to think. And I think a lot of why we're in this super polarized thing is that we have been trained or encouraged to not think for ourselves, not look at data on our own, not come to our own conclusions, and just accept my tribe said this, I must do what they say. I'm thinking, and I'm like, it's madness. It's madness. If we just thought more independently. So I'll have you back. And I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor. I will email you a copy of the show. And I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for being honest about the nature of academy today. It's not a discussion the public gets to hear. And I think it's an important discussion. And there's many professors who, like you said, are correctly worried about mentioning this topic, even though it's true. And I worry that if we don't have balance in academia, academia will lose its prized position of being the solution maker for society because we just won't accept it. And then we're going to be in a real bad spot. So I appreciate people like you coming on to go, hey, there's some internal soul searching we need to be doing amongst the people who are telling us how to fix our country. And they themselves aren't perfect. And because if people have this belief that an expert said it on TV, therefore it's true, and you don't need to question it, and it'll work perfectly. And that's only getting us into trouble because we don't think for ourselves and we don't go, well, there's another expert who has a different opinion. Maybe you should listen to that too. So thank you, Professor. I'll leave it there.
All right. Good luck with the show. All right. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.